The Tin Drum is one of the best movies I've reviewed on this channel. I guess I would call it an absurdist folk opera about the rise of fascism. This movie is in a class of its own, really. It is poignant in images and ideas, playful, weird, unsettling, beautiful and sordid, extremely intimate, hard-hitting, funny, and ultimately a remarkably deep look at the rise of fascism in Germany. The only movies I can think of in the same ballpark at all, maybe something like Underground, directed by Amir Kusturica, another magical realism film about war, but this movie is more humanist, I think, and in a lot of ways more subtle. At times, The Tin Drum reminds me a bit of some Werner Herzog movies, like maybe The Enigma of Caspar Hauser or Heart of Glass, but this is way more ambitious, being a huge historical film. I'm only going to scratch the surface of this immense movie in this video. An immense movie based on an immense book written by Günter Grass, a book I haven't read. The book came out in 1959, the movie came out in 1979, and it was directed by Volker Schlondorf. It won the Golden Palm and the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. Technically, it shared the Golden Palm with Apocalypse Now. I'll start out with some interesting background and then try to pull apart some of the many, many ideas in this movie. All things considered, Volker Schlondorf is not a very well-known director. The Tin Drum is his biggest film by far, although he made a number of interesting countercultural films in the 60s, which I would like to watch, and he made a few Hollywood films, including the 1990 version of The Handmaid's Tale, starring Faye Dunaway. Nonetheless, Volker Schlondorf really got around in the world of cinema, even if he didn't have many huge hits. He started his career off in France, allegedly trying to forget that he was German. He worked with Alain Resnais, Louis Malle, and Jean-Pierre Melville, among others. He was the assistant director on Last Year at Marienbad, for instance. Very interesting movie. Eventually, he would start directing his own movies alongside other young German filmmakers like Werner Herzog, Rainier Fassbinder. He was married to another notable young German director, Margarete von Trotta. Later in his career, he helped Jiang Wen edit the brilliant film In the Heat of the Sun. He also made a couple of documentaries about Billy Wilder, one of his idols. Very, very broad career from Volker Schlondorf, who also, I think, looks quite a bit like Walter White, and maybe is being portrayed by Bryan Cranston. This all maybe fits in with this film, which is extremely eclectic. The Tin Drum follows a young boy named Oscar, who is given a tin drum on his 3rd birthday, the same day an accident stunts his growth. He remains in stasis as Nazis take over Germany and Poland. Oscar was played by 11-year-old actor David Bennett, who had a growth disability in real life. This is probably the greatest child acting I have ever seen. I'm serious. I'm not sure what else compares. Last week, of course, Sundays in Sibel. Great acting from Patricia Goetze, but man, it's hard to compete. With David Bennett in this movie. The cast also includes Mario Adorf, who played Biaggi, the radio operator, in the film The Red Tent, which I reviewed on this channel. Great movie. He also had a small role in Lion of the Desert, another all-time great historical film. Angela Winkler is in it. She was in the remake of Suspiria. Daniel Olbrychski, not sure how to pronounce his name, was in an episode of The Decalogue and had small roles in To Kill a Priest and The Unbearable Lightness of Being, both of which I've reviewed on this channel. And the cast is rounded out by Charles Aznavour, a French pop singer, Armenian heritage, I think. French Sinatra, you might say. He is fantastic in this movie. The screenplay was developed in collaboration with the original author, Günter Grass, and Jean-Claude Carrière, who was probably most famous for collaborating with Buñuel on some of his biggest films. Carrière also wrote the screenplay for The Unbearable Lightness of Being, although if you've watched my review of it, you'll know I don't think that movie is any good. Carrière was also the script consultant for the Michael Haneke film The White Ribbon, which I have reviewed on this channel and which has some ideas in common with this movie. Finally, the score for this film is by Maurice Jarre, who also scored last week's film, Sundays in Sibel. Okay, that's the trivia, the connections out of the way. Some very interesting people involved in making this movie. Volker Schlondorf, very interesting character. I've read a couple interviews with him. Seems like an extremely thoughtful director, and it shows in this film. Broadly speaking, you could probably call the tin drum part of the new German cinema, although it was a little bit late on the scene. The new West German cinema, I guess you might say, which was a somewhat disjoint movement looking to reject cinema's role in mainstream hegemony. These movements are always trying to reject something, I guess. Of course, Nazi propaganda films were an extreme example of what they did not want to do, an existential scar on the medium. Certain post-war genres were also in the crosshairs, such as the Heimat film, which were romantic films about the homeland that presented basically an alternative to the tragedies of World War II, erasing the crisis to some extent. New German cinema had philosophical underpinnings in the Frankfurt School. It even had a manifesto. The tin drum is, like I said, maybe a bit late for the movement, but it's a good fit, I think. It's not hard to see how this movie rejects a few things. For one thing, it's an extremely unromantic film. Could not be farther away from a romantic film about the homeland. It opens with Oscar recounting his lineage, which spawns from an arsonist and a woman he meets in a gloomy potato field. It's a sordid heritage. This film has a lot of intimacy in it and conspicuous sexuality, but the few flickers of romance are quickly doused. On the propaganda front, this movie is really just too bizarre to ever be propaganda. For example, later in the story of Oscar's family, we hear that his grandfather disappeared, but that some think he went to the United States, where he became a millionaire. The film embraces this playful conspiracy by showing us a few dreamlike shots of it playing out. Very interesting little stylistic choices here. This opening sequence sort of culminates with a shot of Oscar being born, a shot that a point of view shot from inside the womb of him emerging. Another pretty odd way to kick things off, and a way that with style, the film rejects a certain type of classicism. This entire opening section has an interesting tone. Oscar's narrative is unexpected. He probably isn't an entirely reliable narrator either. This frame is totally different from the authoritarian frame of something like Triumph of the Will. Often historical films are thought of as being safe. This movie is unsafe. It's kind of a radical history in some ways. Now, I don't know if the socio-political currents of this movement are as striking today, but this is still a unique film with an interesting language that rejects multiple types of classicism. And even if you aren't personally sick of Heimat film, I think you will still like it. The focal point of the tin drum is really this kid, Oscar. On some level, Oscar's function might seem straightforward. He provides a certain frame around a crucial piece of history, the story of a child that lives through the rise of fascism. Not someone who grows up during the rise of fascism, but the perspective of a child who somehow lived through the entire thing. Something that is temporally impossible, but also unlikely given the puncturing and scarring events of the era. Presumably, most kids at the time would have grown up fast, but Oscar doesn't grow up at all. If we really listen to the movie, though, we see there's some tensions. At times, Oscar is an innocent onlooker, seemingly taking the moral measure of the world, the moral compass of the story. But other times, he is a bystander, not acting. And a bystander is something more negative. Often, he actually does have a direct role in unfolding turmoil. Oscar is an unstable character. Is his stunted growth a rebellion against the cruelty of adulthood? Is it an inevitable symptom of a fraught historical moment, a sort of malnutrition of the soul? Or is it a refusal to be mature, something much more self-centered, something possibly at the roots of brutality? Isn't an example of the childishness that spurred on Nazism or stood by as it took place? Does it tease out cruelty in adults by association or by contrast? Oscar is a terror at times. He harasses his teachers. He harasses his family. He bangs his drum constantly. He also, it turns out, can break glass with his voice. From the beginning, it's clear that he has a healthy ego, although some of his self-aggrandizement borders on satire. Remember, Oscar's growth is stunted on his third birthday, before the rise of fascism. Interesting. Later, he takes that tin drum along to a Nazi rally where he hides under the stage and drums along with the band. things go completely haywire in this scene, which is truly a hard scene to pin down at all, just as Oscar is a hard character to pin down. When Roger Ebert reviewed The Tin Drum, he gave it 2 stars, and one of his main complaints was that the Oscar character didn't make sense. He said, and I'm going to quote here, "Here we are at the central problem of the movie. Should I, as a member of the audience, decide to take the drum as, say, a child's toy, protest against the marching cadences of the German armies? Or should I allow myself to be annoyed by the child's obnoxious habit of banging on it whenever something's not to his liking? Even if I buy the wretched drum as a moral symbol, I'm still stuck with the kid as a pious little bastard." I'm reading this quote, but in my own cadence, it didn't quite work out there, but you get the idea. Roger Ebert definitely watched the movie, but that's about it. To me, the inextricability of Oscar is one of the main virtues of the film. In a way, it's kind of kindling for the whole movie, the unstable platform the whole thing is built on. Rather than having a melodramatic or a moralistic frame, which is common for the subject matter, we get something a lot more oblique here when we look through the eyes of Oscar. A lot more interesting and incisive, I think. I wonder if Roger Ebert read Don Quixote and thought, well, are we supposed to think this guy is a fool or a hero? Come on, Cervantes, which one is it? The Tin Drum is definitely based on a book. It is novelesque, picaresque, you might say. And it might not be a perfect adaptation. The pacing, it's a little weird. There's some loose ends, but the complexity, or some level of complexity from the book, definitely makes it into the movie. Apparently, Schlondorf and Carrier wanted Oscar to be like Chaplin's tramp. Which is pretty interesting in some ways. This is an innocent character, and in some ways, quite the opposite. But isn't that part of the answer to one of the most central questions asked about this time? How complicit people are and how their day-to-day lives and thoughts related to the tragedy that was going on? One interesting aspect of the film is Oscar's sexual life. Yes, he has the body of a 3-year-old, but that doesn't stop him from having relationships with girls that are technically his age, but look older, women who are much older than him, but are dwarves, so kind of look like him, and women that are much older than him who are not dwarves. Remember, the actor involved in these scenes was 11 years old when they were filmed. This film went through a number of censorship debacles. I wouldn't say that the movie feels dated, but there's a certain frankness to it that feels at home in 1979 in Germany. Had Oscar's growth not been stunted, these scenes probably wouldn't have been very interesting. But as it is, they make you squirm a little bit. Oscar being a child alienates the audience from everyday life, alienates the audiences from all the banal cruelties, sacrifices, and compromises of adulthood, from all the strangeness that goes into intimacy and relationships and history. Things that become more and more extreme as Germany succumbs to Nazism. To me, one of the biggest metaphors in this film isn't the tin drum. It's actually the consumption of food. Eating things comes up again in the film. For instance, early in the movie, Oscar is forced to eat some disgusting soup made by local bullies. This reminds me a bit of The White Ribbon, which really zooms in on the children who would grow up to be in the Third Reich and their parents. It really focuses on the relationship between children and parents. We get a taste of that here, but The White Ribbon is a much more thorough look at that and really looks at the intergenerational thing. There aren't a lot of other kids in this movie. There's, like I said, there's some scenes that take place and show Oscar at school, but for the most part, there's not a lot of children in this movie, and we are focused maybe more on the adults, but this is always something to think about in these historical films with kids in them a little bit, like The White Ribbon or the fantastic, all-time great historical film, A Brighter Summer Day. All-time great film, honestly. One of the best movies I've ever seen. A movie that is seemingly shows children, but is really maybe about adults by reflection. Again, Oscar having this sort of very unstable role puts a bit of a twist on all this. The movie moves on too quickly to be anywhere near as thorough as either of those movies, but there's something there. Anyway, with this soup, we see the vulnerability of the mouth. We also see Oscar being vulnerable and singled out for one of the first times. He seems almost unstoppable in earlier scenes where he's able to bend his parents and relatives to his will with his ability to shatter glass and bang a drum constantly. Here, not so much. It's interesting. There's something about agency here, the mouth, and agency, food, and agency. Probably the most famous scene in the movie comes a bit later when Oscar's family goes to the beach. The composition of this scene is incredible. This is a beautifully shot movie. You realize that, maybe not in the opening scene with the gloomy potato field, but there's a scene very early on where Oscar's grandfather is running across a bunch of logs that are floating on a river, and the way the light reflects off the logs, I thought, oh yeah, this is going to be a good movie. But this scene on the beach is great. The costuming is extremely vivid. Cinematography, great. It's a dynamite scene. One of many phenomenal scenes in this movie. During their long walk on the beach, the family comes up to a fisherman. Minor spoiler here, but the fisherman pulls in his line, which is attached to a rotting horse head that is infested with eels. And as eels slide out of the horse's nose and severed neck, the fisherman gathers them up and sells them to Oscar's father. Back at home, Dad tries to force his wife, Oscar's mom, Agnes, to eat them, gobbling them down himself, seemingly as part of some fascistic show of strength and resolve. It might seem a bit like the bullies with the soup earlier on. Agnes finds her relationship with food forever altered. Probably not in the way you would expect, though. This is kind of a war movie, but we only briefly go to a battlefield. Most of the action takes place on the home front, where food is a big thing. It's what's for dinner. Of course, you also use your mouth for speaking. Like I said, maybe a bigger idea about agency, domesticity, conformity here. This movie keeps a lot of its meaning guarded, to be honest. It's full of contradictions. You might say it's dialectical. And to some degree, I think it's above analysis. Just something to experience, images and ideas that will last a lifetime. Like I said, so many strong scenes. There's a scene where Oscar sort of becomes aware that his mother might be carrying on with another man, that's cut in between her and this man making love, filmed in a way that is so mixed, such mixed emotions, cutting together this sort of the child's resentment, almost jealousy that his mother is doing something without him, with the passion of the mom. So many little details, like the pants sliding off the end of the bed. This movie has, like I said, a lot of just so many great moments that make it worth the price of admission alone. The movie does have a slightly strange pacing, like I said. They actually omitted the last third of the book from the film. Still, it feels like it covers a huge amount of ground. I think the first half is more cohesive than the second, which shows Oscar going on the road with a circus of dwarves to entertain Nazi troops, among other things. This is a fairly unhinged movie, although I get the feeling that the book is even more unhinged. The movie might be a little bit more sentimental, a little bit less dark humor in it. For some reason, the absurd approach seems to strike deeper into history than anything else could. And, you know, I started off with a huge list of adjectives to describe this film: funny, hard-hitting, intimate, or whatever, but maybe the one that rises above them all is just deep. Not in a contrived way, not in a pretentious way, not with any particular moral, but one that does justice, I think, to the time. So that's The Tin Drum, and it really is an incredible movie. I feel like the review doesn't even come close to capturing all the ideas and all the pieces of this movie, in part because I've been a little bit ill this week, but also because I don't think any review could really come close to doing this incredible film justice. So we'll see. We've got some more extremely serious movies coming up on the channel, but it'll be hard to top The Tin Drum.